At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's General G. Let's begin. Exara's soldiers numbered nearly 100, each encased in an exoskeleton and equipped with the finest weapons the Aziri arsenal could provide. Hovercraft and drones floated above, their weapons pointing to a single human. And all of this simply because that human had accused the Aziri of harming the local fauna. Exara, of course, trusted her superiors, who had assured her those tales of injured animals were nothing more than exaggerations. Now, though, she was ready to challenge his accusations, but first, she needed to capture him. "Surrender now, human. You're outnumbered," she called across the wide clearing, her long blue hair flowing around her skin tinged pink. Her face, elvish, the humans called it, hardened when he failed to answer, her jade-green eyes fixed on him with the cold sharpness of a monomolecular blade. Seconds dragged by as the small army behind her grew taut with tension, fingers brushing their triggers, waiting for her command. Still, the human said nothing, and then at last he spoke. "Outnumbered?" he echoed. "Perhaps I am, but so are you." Exara's brow furrowed beneath her tactical visor. What kind of response was that? The human stood alone in the center of the clearing. No weapons visible except for what looked like a primitive staff carved from local wood. Her soldiers shifted behind her, plasma rifles loaded and ready. One word from her and he'd become nothing more than a collection of cauterized holes and scattered atoms. But she needed him alive. The interrogation demanded it. She had to know who was funding these eco-terrorist activities, what networks he was connected to, which colonial factions were supporting this insurrection against Aziri authority. Her finger hovered over the comm unit at her throat, ready to give the order for a non-lethal takedown, when the first sound reached her elongated ears. A chittering, low, constant, almost like laughter echoing from a dozen throats at once. Then came a rumble, deep enough to feel through the reinforced soles of her combat boots, traveling up through her exoskeleton's frame like the planet itself was growling. The tactical display in her visor began registering movement signatures. Dozens at first, then hundreds, blooming across the forest line like drops of blood spreading through water. The possibility struck her like a plasma bolt to the chest, so absurd she almost dismissed it. Somehow, impossibly, the human had tamed the local fauna. Before she could do anything, the battlefield erupted into pure chaos. From every direction, creatures poured into the clearing like a living flood. The first wave consisted of shadows given deadly form, ambush predators that had been completely invisible against the purple-barked trees until the moment they chose to move. Their bodies were apparently capable of adaptive camouflage that would make Aziri stealth tech jealous. Scale shifting from bark brown to grass green to stone gray as they bounded forward on 6 powerful legs that seemed to barely touch the ground. Behind them came the tanks, massive creatures that looked as if the planet itself had decided to stand up and go to war. Their bodies were covered in what appeared to be natural armor made of compressed stone and mineral deposits, fused to their flesh over countless generations of evolution until they were walking fortresses. But it was the third type that truly turned the battle from a fight into complete pandemonium. Mid-sized creatures with impossibly long necks that swayed like serpents and mouths that opened wide enough to swallow a helmet whole. Their scaled bodies were unremarkable. No camouflage, no armor, no obvious weapons beyond rows of flat teeth. But there were hundreds of them, flowing across the battlefield like a river of flesh and scale, overwhelming through sheer numbers and nothing more. "Form defense circles!" Exara shouted into her comm. "Concentrate fire on the large ones. Watch your spacing." But the commands were lost in the madness. Through the chaos, she glimpsed her soldiers firing wildly, their disciplined formations shattered like glass. An ambush predator materialized from thin air beside a heavy weapons specialist, jaw clamping down on his rifle and tearing it from his hands before vanishing again. "Captain!" Her comm crackled with static and panic. Hovercraft 3 is down. The numbers are overwhelming our targeting systems. We can't get a lock on anything. The creatures are... The transmission cut to white noise and screaming. She looked up to see one of their aerial units spinning out of control, some kind of flying creature with membranous wings tangled in its roots, both going down together in a death spiral. Hovercraft 2 reporting. We're taking multiple bogeys. There's too many. Losing altitude. Another burst of static, another craft falling from the sky like a dropped stone. What was the human's endgame? This wasn't just an escape attempt, it was too coordinated, too deadly, too deliberately orchestrated. Her mind tried to process the battlefield, but it was like trying to map a hurricane from inside the eye wall. Then she saw him through the madness. The human was riding one of the tank creatures, his legs gripping its massive neck, one hand twisted in what looked like naturally occurring handholds in its rocky armor, while the other still held that staff. He wasn't fleeing toward the forest safety. He was coming straight for her, weaving through the battlefield like a mad creature. Ixara's training took over, years of combat drilling overriding shock. She drew her energy pistol in a single motion, the weapon ready to fire, the targeting reticule in her visor locked on to the human's center mass, and she squeezed the trigger without a second thought. The creature beneath him shifted with surprising agility, banking left like a fighter craft avoiding missile lock. The energy bolt sizzled through empty air, leaving a bright afterimage. She fired again, leading the target this time, compensating for the creature's movement pattern, but the human had already ducked low against the creature's neck, using its bulk as cover. The bolt passed over his head, close enough to singe his dark hair. The tank creature was almost upon her, each footfall sending tremors through the ground. She dove right and came up in a perfect three-point crouch with her pistol raised. The human and his mount thundered past, close enough that she could smell the creature's alien musk, and she tracked them with her weapon, ready to... Her hand grabbed her wrist with crushing force. Another wrapped around her waist like a steel cable. The human had jumped from the creature at the last possible second, using its bulk to mask his approach completely. She tried to bring the pistol around, but his grip was too strong, forcing her arm up and away from any useful angle. She triggered her exoskeleton strength boost, servos whining as they pushed to maximum output, but he was already lifting her, using her own momentum and overextension against her. "Let go of me!" she snarled, trying to drive an armored elbow into his ribs. The blow should have shattered bone, but he moved like flowing water, redirecting the force while maintaining his grip. The tank creature had circled back with surprising agility. With a grunt of effort that she felt through his chest, the human heaved her up onto its back, then vaulted up behind her in a single rushed motion, his arms encircling her to grip the creature's rocky protrusions. "My apologies, Captain," he said, his breath warm against her ear, voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "But we need to have a conversation away from all this noise." The creature lurched into motion, accelerating faster than something that size had any right to move. Ixara had to grab onto its armor to keep from falling, her fingers finding purchase in a small horn. They were racing toward the forest line, leaving the battlefield, her battlefield, where she suddenly had every conceivable tactical advantage, behind. "This is kidnapping!" she shouted over the wind, rushing past them. "My soldiers will hunt you down! The entire Aziri fleet will—" "Your soldiers are a bit busy right now," the human replied with infuriating calmness. She twisted to look back and saw he was right. The clearing was complete chaos. Soldiers and creatures locked in a melee that looked more like an extremely violent dance than a battle. The sounds of combat faded as they plunged deeper into the alien forest. The tank creature moved quickly through the dense undergrowth, following paths invisible to her eyes, ducking under low-hanging branches that would have decapitated her if she hadn't ducked when the human pressed down on her shoulder in warning. They traveled for perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt like hours with her mind racing through escape scenarios and calculating how badly this would damage her career. The forest grew denser, stranger, with bioluminescent fungi creating patches of green light and flowers that seemed to track their movement. Finally, the creature slowed near a massive tree that must have been ancient even by this world's standards. Ahead, she could see a structure built into the massive trunk. It was simple but elegantly crafted, with windows that glowed with soft bioluminescent panels and a design that seemed to merge with the tree rather than impose upon it. This is where the human lived, she realized. Her mind raced through the implications. Was she a hostage now? Would he demand ransom? Contact her superiors with demands? This could destroy her military career entirely. The creature knelt with surprising gentleness, and the human slid off, then offered her a hand down. She ignored it, jumping down on her own despite the awkward angle, her armor's shock absorbers taking the impact. Her boots hit the soft forest floor with a muffled thump, and she immediately took a defensive stance, weight balanced, ready to fight or flee. "What do you want?" she demanded, her hand moving to her backup weapon. "If you think you can use me as leverage—" But the human had turned away from her entirely, seemingly unconcerned about her little knife. He was stroking the tank creature's massive head, speaking to it in human language. The creature made a sound like an avalanche trying to purr, a deep rumble she felt in her chest, then lumbered off into the forest, each footfall growing fainter until it was gone. "Thank you, old friend," the human said, genuine warmth in his voice. Only then did he turn to face her, and she got her first real look at him. Dark hair that needed cutting, sun-weathered skin that spoke of years under alien suns, eyes the color of earth coffee, or so she had been told, having never seen earth coffee herself. There were scars too, old ones, the kind that came from wildfire rather than warfare, but it was his expression that caught her off guard. There was something in it that wasn't quite what she expected from a terrorist. Sadness, perhaps, disappointment, maybe even pity. "Captain Ixara, wasn't it?" he asked, though they both knew he knew exactly who she was. "You know who I am. What I want to know is what you intend to do with me. Ransom? Prisoner exchange? Some kind of political statement?" He studied her for a long moment, head tilted slightly like one of the native birds she'd seen in the briefings. "I brought you here because I need to show you something," he said finally. "Show me?" She laughed, sharp and bitter, the sound harsh in the peaceful forest. "You kidnapped an Azeri military officer, attacked my entire unit, just to show me something?" "Would you have come if I'd simply asked?" His tone was mild, reasonable, which somehow made it worse. She opened her mouth for an angry retort, then closed it. They both knew the answer. She would have shot him on sight if he'd approached peacefully. "My name is Leon," he continued, seemingly unbothered by her silence. "Leon Castelli. And despite what your intelligence reports probably say, I'm not a terrorist, Captain. I'm a xenobiologist. Or I was before your people decided this planet didn't need one. You attacked our operations, sabotaged equipment worth millions of credits. That makes you—" "Someone trying to prevent an extinction event," he interrupted, his calm finally cracking to show heat beneath. "Look, I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm asking you just one night. Let me show you what I need to show you. In the morning, I'll return you to your people unharmed. You have my word." "The word of a terrorist?" "The word of someone who could have let those creatures tear your soldiers apart, but made sure they wouldn't. Check your communication equipment. I'm betting you're not getting a lot of casualty reports." She activated her comm unit, surprised to find it still functional despite the distance and interference. The channels were chaotic, filled with overlapping voices and status reports. But as she filtered through the noise, she realized he was right. "One night," Leon repeated. "That's all I ask. Let me show you why I've been fighting your terraforming efforts." Ixara weighed her options carefully. She was alone in hostile territory with a man who had just orchestrated her capture using an army of wild animals. But he was also alone with her, and her exoskeleton still functioned at full capacity. If he'd wanted to harm her, he'd had better opportunities. And there was something else, a nagging curiosity about how he'd managed what should have been impossible. "Fine," she said finally, hating how the word tasted. "One night. But if this is some kind of trick—" "It's not." He turned toward the forest. "Come on. We need to reach the first site before full dark. The nocturnal ecosystem is something you need to see to believe." He started walking down a barely visible path, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed. The forest grew denser as they moved away from his shelter, the canopy above so thick that only scattered beams of moonlight penetrated. She activated her helmet's flashlight to better see the treacherous ground. Instantly, he whirled around and snatched the device from her hand. Before she could protest, he crushed it between his fingers, the advanced polymer and circuitry crumbling like dried leaves. She noticed the augmentation scarring on his hands. Subtle work, probably black market. "What are you? That was military equipment. Do you have any idea how much?" "It would have ruined your night vision," he said calmly, brushing the fragments from his palms. "And you'll need that to see what I'm going to show you. The bioluminescence here is subtle. Your eyes need time to adjust. Here." He offered his arm like some gentleman from an ancient Earth period drama. "The path is tricky in the dark." "I'm not going to—" "Captain, you can either hold on to me for guidance, or you can stumble around and probably break something expensive again. Your choice. That armor might protect you from a fall, but it won't help you keep your body dry, and this place is full of puddles." She stood there in the growing darkness, fury burning in her chest like a small star. Everything about the situation was wrong, backwards, humiliating. She was a military officer, trained in many forms of combat, wearing some of the most advanced armor in the galaxy. She should not need to hold on to this human's arm like some helpless civilian at a diplomatic function. But the darkness was nearly complete now, and she could barely see her own feet. Her armor systems were designated for combat, not careful navigation through alien forests. With a sound of disgust that she made sure he heard, she grabbed his arm. "This is temporary," she muttered. "Of course." She could hear the smile in his voice, which made her grip his arm harder than necessary. The journey was shorter than she expected. Within minutes, she began to notice something strange. The darkness wasn't complete anymore. There were lights, soft, organic lights that her helmet's harsh illumination would have completely washed out. Phosphorescent fungi climbing tree trunks in spiraling patterns that looked almost like writing. Flowers that glowed like fallen stars, their petals translucent. And then they emerged from the tree line, and she forgot to be angry. The lake stretched before them like a mirror full of galaxies. But these weren't reflections. The water itself glowed with life. Schools of luminescent fish created rivers of light beneath the surface, their synchronized movements forming patterns that looked artistic. Plants with transparent leaves that showed their glowing veins swayed in the shallow waters, each one a different color: blue, green, gold, purple. Creatures she had no names for moved along the shore, their bodies traced in lines of biological light, some steady, some changing, some flickering in patterns that seemed to respond to each other. "By the ancients," she breathed, not realizing she'd spoken aloud until Leon chuckled softly. "Beautiful, isn't it? This is Lake Quieta, one of the few places your terraforming chemicals haven't reached yet." She found herself walking forward without conscious thought, drawn to the water's edge as if magnetized. The warmth surprised her. Not hot, but pleasantly warm, like a bath drawn just right. "There must be hundreds of species here," she said, her rusty science knowledge overriding her anger for a moment. "Thousands," Leon corrected, kneeling by the water's edge. "The lake has its own ecosystem, 5 distinct depth zones, each with its own communities." Something rustled in the shadows beside them, and Leon turned with a genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him. "And there's someone I want you to meet. Noodle? Come on out, boy. It's safe." Ixara stared. "Noodle?" A creature emerged from the undergrowth, and she immediately understood the name. It was small, barely reaching her knees when it stood on its hind legs, with a body roughly the size of a domestic earth cat. But its tail was absolutely absurd, easily 5 times the length of its body, thin and prehensile, moving like a snake or a tentacle. The creature approached cautiously, its large eyes reflecting the lake's growth like polished gems. It stretched up upon its hind legs, nose twitching as it sniffed in her direction, whiskers vibrating at frequencies her armor detected but couldn't interpret. "It's all right," Leon said softly in that melodic human language. "She's a friend. Well, potentially." Ixara stood perfectly still as the creature, Noodle, investigated her boots with intense concentration, then her leg armor, sniffing with the dedication of a quality control inspector. Using its incredible tail like a fifth limb, Noodle wrapped it around Leon's neck and practically flowed up his body, the movement so fluid it looked like water running upward. It came to rest on his shoulder, perfectly balanced, tail swaying contentedly. Leon reached up to scratch behind its surprisingly large ears, and it made a sound somewhere between a purr and a whistle that her translator gave up trying to classify. Despite everything, despite being kidnapped, despite her anger, despite the complete destruction of her mission and probably her career, Ixara felt something in her chest soften slightly. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked quietly, not wanting to disturb the peace of the moment. Leon was quiet for a moment, his hand still absently petting Noodle, who had started grooming his hair with tiny, careful hands. "Because you needed to see it alive first," he said finally, his voice heavy with something she couldn't quite identify. "This place, as it is now, before I show you what your people have done to its sister lake 5 kilometers north, you need to understand what's being lost." "My people haven't," she started defensively. "Haven't what?" he interrupted, though his voice stayed level. "Haven't been dumping harmless chemical byproducts into the water system? Haven't been told by their scientists that the T-47 compounds break down safely in alien environments? Haven't been lying to you, Captain, about the true cost of your expansion here?" She wanted to argue, to defend the Azeri colonization efforts, to repeat the talking points about bringing civilization to wild worlds, but something held her back. Maybe it was the life around her, so abundant it seemed impossible that anything could threaten it. Maybe it was the way Noodle was now playing with Leon's hair, completely trusting, tiny, hands gentle. Maybe it was the sadness in the human's eyes that spoke of losses already witnessed. They stayed by the lake for hours. Leon told her about his years on the planet before the Azeri arrived, how he'd been part of the first survey team back when humanity still thought they might colonize here, how he'd stayed behind when the surveys found a planet that looks tough but is too delicate for humans, choosing to catalog life rather than exploit it. He showed her the nocturnal feeders that emerged as the night deepened, creatures that looked like living ribbons of light, their bodies so thin they were nearly two-dimensional. He explained how the bioluminescence wasn't just for show, it was communication, warning, courtship, and hunting all at once. To her surprise, she found herself sharing her own stories. Her childhood on Azir Prime, where the cities floated above endless clouds and you could only see the ground on clear days. "You weren't always a soldier," Leon observed, absently feeding Noodle some kind of fruit from his pocket. "No, I was a surveyor first, not unlike you. But the military paid better and—" She trailed off, not sure why she was telling him this. "The career path was clearer. Make captain by 30, major by 35, maybe admiral before 50 if you played things right." "And is that what you want? Admiral's stripes?" She didn't answer immediately, watching as a school of fish moved through the shallows, their lights creating beautiful patterns. "I used to think so. Now, with this shameful kidnapping—" Deep into the night, when the two moons, one red, one silver, had risen high enough to cast shadows through the canopy, Leon stood. Noodle chittered in protest at the movement, but settled back onto his shoulder. "It's time," he said simply. "For what?" "To show you why I've been fighting." The journey to the second lake was shorter, following a path that might once have been a game trail. She noticed that she didn't mind the darkness as much now. Her eyes had adjusted, and she could see the subtle variations in shadow and faint light. Holding his arm for guidance felt less like surrender and more like practicality. Noodle had curled up around Leon's neck like a living scarf, occasionally chittering at sounds in the forest that she couldn't hear. She smelled it before she saw it. The absence of life has its own scent. Sterile, chemical, wrong. It hit her olfactory sensors like a wall, and even through her armor's filters, she could taste it on the back of her throat. The second lake was black. Not the living darkness of night, but the black of void, of absence, of negation. No lights danced beneath its surface. No creatures moved along its shores. The only illumination came from the red moon above, turning the water the color of old blood, of warning, of danger. Leon led her to a small pipe jutting from the ground, its Aziri manufacture obvious in its design. The corporate markings were still visible. Aziri Colonial Development Building Better Worlds. Runoff pipe, he said simply, his voice carefully controlled. Your terraforming station is 12 kilometers that way. This is where the T-47 compounds end up after they've been safely processed. He knelt by the water's edge, careful not to touch it, and began to speak. He explained exactly what the chemicals did, how they disrupted the cellular membranes of frail native organisms, causing them to literally dissolve from the inside out. This lake was more alive than quieta, he said, his control finally slipping to show the pain underneath. I remember it clearly. I had a camp right there. He pointed to a barren stretch of shore where the ground was still discolored, where I spent 3 months documenting nocturnal spawning behaviors. There was a species of fish here that existed nowhere else on the planet. All gone now. Exara found herself walking to the water's edge, her armor's biohazard alarms screaming warnings she ignored. The datapad in her armor began taking readings automatically, chemical analysis scrolling across her display. The levels were exactly what Leon had described. She thought of the reports she'd read, the assurances from her superiors that the environmental impact was minimal, acceptable, necessary for progress. The cost of civilization, they'd call it. They'd lied, or been lied to, or simply hadn't cared enough to verify. How many? She asked quietly. How many lakes like this? 30 that I know of. 3 major river systems. He pulled out a battered datapad. Ruggedized, old, probably predating the Aziri arrival. The screen glowed bright, showing images that made her stomach turn. Time-lapse videos of lakes dying, the light going out day by day. Beaches covered in rotting fish. Forests of kelp analogs withering to nothing. This is just what I've been able to document personally, he continued. This planet looks tough on the surface, but it's actually very, very sensitive. And that's why humanity never truly claimed it. We knew we would destroy it, even with all our modern tech. She sat down hard on a rock, not caring that her armor would need recalibration. The weight of it, not just the armor, but the knowledge, was crushing. Leon sat beside her, keeping respectful distance. Noodle uncurled from his neck and investigated a dead log, sniffed it once, then returned with a sad whistle. They stayed there through the night. Leon showed her his complete documentation. Photos of this lake from before, teeming with so much life, the water itself seemed to glow even in daylight. Videos of creatures now extinct, things that looked like swimming flowers, fish with transparent bodies showing internal organs failing and dying, data showing the spread of contamination, the die-offs, the cascading ecosystem collapses as food webs unraveled. The red moon had set, and the planet's sun began to cast its first pale violet rays across the sky. The light did not bring life to the dead lake. It only illuminated the desolation more clearly, revealing an oily sheen on the black water and the skeletal remains of lakeside flora. Exara had not moved. All night she had stared at the screen of Leon's datapad, cross-referencing his findings with her own armor's atmospheric and chemical sensors. Every data point was a nail in the coffin of her loyalty. Fatigue was a dull ache behind her eyes, but it was overshadowed by a burning, crystalline rage. It was a cold fury, directed not at the human beside her, but at the admirals and corporate liaisons who had sent her here. They had spoken of acceptable environmental impact and minimal native die-off. Lies. All of it. She had been a proud soldier of the Aziri, a protector of their interests. Now she saw she had merely been their enforcer, silencing the truth with the barrel of a plasma rifle. She stood, the servos in her armor whining softly in the quiet morning. The weight of her shoulders was immense, far heavier than the plasteel and ceramic plates. Leon watched her, his expression unreadable, noodle stirring on his shoulder. "Your data," she said, her voice hard and raspy. "I need a complete copy." She looked past him, toward the distant glimmer of the Aziri orbital station. Her path was no longer there. It led somewhere else now, somewhere far more dangerous. "I will take this to the Federation High Council. They might not believe you, but they will believe the words of an Aziri like me," she declared, the words tasting of treason and finality. It would cost her everything, her rank, her reputation, perhaps even her freedom. She would be branded a traitor by her own people. But as the sun rose higher over a dying world, she knew it was the only honorable command left to follow. Days had passed in a blur of interrogations and sterile silence. The woman who looked back at Ixara from the polished metal of the wall panel was a stranger. Gone was the form-fitting black exoskeleton, the symbol of her rank and power. In its place was a loose-fitting gray prisoner's uniform that hung on her frame. Her long blue hair, usually tied back in a severe military style, was now unkempt, framing a face where the pink-tinged skin was pale with exhaustion. Only her jade-green eyes held the same fire, but now it was the cold fire of rebellion, not duty. She was a scapegoat. It was a masterful, if predictable, political maneuver. After she had transmitted Leon's complete, unredacted data pack directly to the Federation High Council, bypassing her entire chain of command, the Aziri leadership had moved with ruthless speed. They couldn't admit to the deliberate ecological devastation, not with a Federation inquiry looming. So they created a new narrative. Captain Ixara, a promising but overzealous officer, had suffered a psychotic break during a routine operation. In her paranoia, she had fabricated evidence of environmental damage, attacked her own troops using manipulated local fauna, and allowed the terrorist Leon Castelli to escape. The official charges were dereliction of duty, mutiny, and costing the Aziri Colonial Development Corporation billions in damages. A bitter smile touched her lips as she looked at her reflection. The irony was suffocating. She was imprisoned not for the act of treason that had doomed the entire colonization effort under the pressure of the Federation, but for failing to capture the one man who was telling the truth. In a final, galling twist, the Aziri had dropped all charges against Leon, painting him as a mere hermit caught in the crossfire of her rampage. He was no longer even a criminal. Ixara turned from the wall and sank onto the hard cot that served as her bed. A wave of fury washed over her, hot and cleansing. She blamed her superiors, the cold-faced admirals and smiling corporate executives who had lied to her for years, who saw entire ecosystems as entities on a balance sheet. They had used her ambition and her loyalty as a weapon, pointing it at anyone who threatened their profits. But as the anger subsided, a colder truth remained. She blamed herself, too. She had been naive, so eager to climb the ranks and earn the next commendation that she never stopped to ask the hard questions. She had accepted their convenient lies because the truth would have been an obstacle to her career. She had been a willing cog in a monstrous machine, and her outrage now couldn't erase her past complicity. She closed her eyes, imagining her future. A high-security penal colony on Azir Prime, a life spent staring at gray walls, her name a cautionary tale for insubordinate officers. It was in that moment of bleak resignation that she heard it, a low, constant chittering, almost like muffled laughter. It was a familiar sound, one that echoed with the memory of chaos and battle. Her eyes snapped open, scanning the small cell. The noise was coming from the ventilation grate high on the wall near the ceiling. Getting to her feet, she dragged the cot across the floor and climbed on top of it, the metal groaning in protest. Standing on her toes, she could just peer through the slats of the grate. Two enormous, luminous eyes blinked back at her from the darkness of the ductwork. "Noodle?" she whispered in disbelief. The creature chittered again, A happy confirmation. "What are you doing here?" she said, glancing nervously at the door. "You have to go! They'll catch you!" Noodle just tilted his head, seemingly unconcerned. She reached her fingers through the grate, trying to wave him away, but he was just out of reach. Frustrated, she was about to give up when the creature moved with purpose. His absurdly long, prehensile tail, which had been coiled behind him, snaked forward through the grate. Dangling from the tip, held fast in a perfect loop, was a ring of metallic keys. Exara stared, her mind struggling to process the sight. With a final chitter, Noodle released the keys, letting them drop through the grate. She fumbled but caught them before they could clatter onto the floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was impossible. It was a chance. Her hands shaking, she jumped down from the cot and crept to the door. She selected the key that looked most like an access card override and slid it into the lock. For a tense second, nothing happened. Then, with a soft electronic click, the door slid open an inch. Adrenaline surged through her. Her years of training took over, overriding shock in the flash of a moment. Peeking into the corridor, she saw it was empty. The other keys on the ring were for supply closets and maintenance hatches, perfect for navigating the facility unseen. Moving like a shadow, she bypassed the few guards on duty, their bored expressions proof of their confidence in their prisoner's containment. She was a soldier too, not a prisoner, her senses sharp, every step silent as she evaded detection. She finally emerged through a service exit into the humid night air. The scene before her was one of frantic, organized retreat. The colonization effort was being dismantled. Cargo haulers and military transports lifted into the sky in a steady stream, their engines a low rumble that vibrated through the ground. Her evidence had worked. She had won. A movement at the edge of the forest caught her eye. There, standing just inside the tree line, was Leon. He wasn't smiling, but he gave her a slow wave, an invitation. Beside him, Noodle perched on the back of the massive rock-armored creature she had ridden before. The choice was laid bare before her: a life as a fugitive on a world she had helped save, or a return to her people to face a lifetime of imprisonment. The decision wasn't a decision at all, it was an instinct. With the sounds of the Azeri retreat fading behind her, Exara ran. She ran away from the gray walls and the lies and toward the deep, living darkness of the forest. Her future was a mystery, a path unwritten in the stars, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly prepared to face it.